Okay, good afternoon and welcome to our Great Tomato Tasting at Home event. Many of you may have joined us for our Great Tomato Tasting event at the Snyder Research and Extension Farm in person years past. Unfortunately, that couldn't happen this year, so we decided to go virtual and have a few activities for you folks about tomatoes, as everybody loves tomatoes in New Jersey, and address some of your questions. This first session is on growing tomatoes and questions and answers. My name is Pete Nitzsche. I'm an agricultural and natural resources agent with Rutgers Crawford Extension in Morris County. And we also have Bill Hlubik, an agent in Middlesex County, here to help me address some of your questions and also answer them in the chat room. Just so you know where the chat room is on your computer, if you hover above the top of your screen, your mouse, you'll see the chat box. You can click it there and then type your questions as we go along. I will start by covering some general things that we get a lot of times questions on our helplines and addressed to agents. I'll go through a few items and then hopefully that'll answer many of your questions. And then Bill will stop me if we need to address anything more specific, and then other questions towards the end. Well, tomatoes, of course, are one of Jersey's favorite vegetables, or the favorite vegetable. And one of the good things about tomatoes that it doesn't matter what color, shape, or size tomato, if you know a little bit about the cultural requirements and the pest management, you can typically grow just about any type of tomato variety, any color of the rainbow, any shape that you desire. One of the first and common questions we get about tomatoes is what fertilizer is best for tomatoes. And unfortunately, it's really hard to tell you what would be absolutely best without a soil test. So we have a soil testing lab that you can avail yourself to. There are services that'll test the amount of nutrients in the soil, particularly some of the macronutrients, phosphorus, potassium that tomatoes need, calcium, magnesium. It doesn't test for nitrogen, but it does test these other things and tells you the pH. So the pH of the soil is important in liming the soil to that 6 to 6.5. The slides are not coming up, Bill?
I do see the slides right now.
Yeah, out the door.
I'm sorry.
There they are.
Okay. You still seeing them now?
Yes, I see them, Peter. They're there.
Okay. All right. So the pH is important, liming to the proper pH of the soil. The soil test will tell you what your pH is and how much lime you need to add to get it into that 6 to 6.5 range. One of the keys with fertilizers for tomatoes is typically we only want moderate amounts of nitrogen. And so we don't want too much nitrogen. More balanced fertilizers like a 10-10-10 or those type of ratios are typically better for tomatoes, not something like a lawn fertilizer, which would have a rate something like 28.64, something like that. And what we don't want to do is give them tomatoes a lot of nitrogen before the fruit sets. So you can encourage more foliage growth if you put too much nitrogen on early, and we want foliage, but we also want fruit. You can amend the soil with rotted compost and manure. We want to make sure it's well rotted compost and manure that we amend the soil with. At the beginning of the season, both are good fertilizers, but we want to make sure we don't put fresh manure around a fruit crop or a vegetable like tomatoes, and compost is good as well. We can also use granular fertilizers and liquid fertilizers. I tend to put liquid down early, types of liquid fertilizer to give the young seedlings a little boost that's quickly available to the plant when there's a small root ball. And then the granular fertilizers, be it organic or synthetic, are more slowly available during the growing season to amend the soil with. But really, there's no perfect, ideal tomato fertilizer unless you have a soil test to know what's already in your soil. So again, moderate amounts of nitrogen and balanced fertilizer are good for tomatoes. We also get the question, why do I have all foliage, no fruit? One of the issues sometimes is just patience. The gardener has got a plant growing vigorously early and hasn't set fruit yet. But again, we want to avoid too much nitrogen in our fertilizer early. So if we had a heavy application of more fresh manure, that would spur that growth. Using large amounts of turf fertilizer might spur that type of growth. That can happen sometimes, but it's probably more likely the two lower issues, too much heat or too much cold. So tomatoes can be a little bit finicky in their pollination. They need temperatures above 55 degrees to pollinate properly, and below 90. So sometimes, some summers when we get real high temperatures above 90, the flowers abort and we don't get fruit. And so the plant just puts more energy into leaf production. The other big one, we catch a lot of people trying to get their tomatoes to grow, and they've got a lot of trees and they don't have enough sunlight, and that's why they don't have fruit. So we would like to see full sun ideally, but at the bare minimum, you want 6 hours of sunlight in order to grow good quality tomatoes and have fruit besides leaves. One common difficulty we see with tomatoes is a physiological disorder called blossom end rot. Blossom end rot is caused by a lack of calcium in the fruit, and calcium moves through the soil into the roots, up through the water conducting tissues of the plant into the fruit. We see a lot of blossom end rot commonly in first fruit. We also see it in plants in containers a lot of times, and there's probably a higher tendency to see it in paste tomatoes. What can you do about blossom end rot? One thing is, if you don't have enough calcium, and again, your soil test would tell you if you have enough in the soil. And if you don't, you add calcitic lime. There's two types of lime: calcitic, which contains calcium, and dolomitic, which contains magnesium. Both raise the pH, but calcitic adds calcium. Usually there's enough calcium in the soil and it's more of a water issue. And so the gardener is not keeping their soil more evenly moist enough, not wet, moist, you want it. And so you can moderate that a little bit by using mulches. And we also see a lot in containers, as I said. And so a lot of gardeners have a very large tomato plant in a small container that dries out quickly and it wilts. And then you come home from work or being out and you water it. And that wilting wet cycle is disrupting the calcium movement. So if you have a large plant, you want a larger container or potentially a self-watering container. Another big one we're getting at this time of the year: why are the bottom leaves of my tomato plant turning brown? There are a couple very common foliar fungal diseases of tomatoes: early blight and septoria, that live in the soil, overwinter on crop debris, splash up into the leaves and infect the leaves and cause them to turn brown. So if we look at that plant and we're starting at the bottom and we work our way up towards where the foliage is turning green, and look at the leaves closely, in the top image on the right there is early blight, which has half-inch brown spots with target-shaped rings. And below it is septoria, about 1/8 of an inch round spots with light-colored centers. Both are similar fungal diseases that like a lot of leaf wetness in order to affect the plant. They both also come about at about the time the plant is fruiting. So the plant's putting a lot of energy into fruit, kind of letting its guard down, and it can't fight off these diseases. So what can you do about the leaf blight diseases? One thing you can do is look at some tolerant varieties. So there's a list up there. You can jot down a few, but if you're going through catalogs, look for early blight tolerant varieties. There's no varieties that are totally resistant, but some get less early blight and septoria than others, and those are some of the varieties we recommend to folks to try to reduce it. Crop rotation. So if we can avoid it, we don't want to plant tomatoes in the same place every year. As we said, the spores of those diseases overwinter in the soil. So we want to move tomatoes around the garden into a different area every year. so that we avoid the same spot where all those spores may have fallen to the ground on those diseased plants. Good air circulation. You see these rows of plants in the picture here are staked up, good distance between the rows, so you have good air circulation, so the leaves are drying out. These diseases thrive on leaf wetness, so the longer they stay wet from dews or rainfall, the more likely you'll have that disease. So we recommend gardeners water from below, maybe use soaker hoses or drip irrigation if you can, or at the very least, if you're going to use sprinklers, water in the morning so the plant dries out before the evening and the leaves don't stay wet all night. Also, if you have a lot of disease in a particular year, sanitation, so you might, the dead leaves you might cut off and dispose of as the season goes on. You also don't want to till in all those dead and diseased leaves at the end of the year right into your soil. They can go into a compost pile. A very hot compost pile will kill them, kill the spores. But if you're not a really active composter, you probably want to dispose of them someplace else in the yard where you're not going to grow your tomatoes. These diseases also can be controlled with fungicides, and there's a few organic and several synthetic ones. They need to be applied before you see the diseases. For the most effectiveness, they're creating a protective barrier or coating on the leaf to keep the spores from germinating and getting into the leaves. And copper is one that's considered organic. It's a natural metal. And there's also synthetic forms of copper and chlorothalonil mancozeb. And we have more fact sheets we'll reference at the end, our list of fact sheets, but those are a couple about these diseases. What I find is most gardeners don't apply fungicides. They, in a good drier year, they get a lot of tomatoes by the end of the growing season before the early blight and septoria catch up, and then they're satisfied and don't want to do a lot of spraying, both with organic materials or synthetic. Another common question we get on tomatoes is, should I prune my tomato plants? And that kind of depends on what type of plant you are. But first, we'll take a look here at a tomato plant in the image, and you see the main stalk growing up, and then you see compound leaves with little leaflets coming off the stem, and that arrow is pointing to what we call a sucker. And so that's the material that you would prune out if you want to prune your tomato plant to 1 or 2 stems and reduce the overall fruit load. The advantage of doing that, pruning out the suckers and limiting the amount of growth, is you'll get the first cluster of fruit will ripen up a little bit earlier, and then what fruit remains is larger. So you've taken potential flowers off the plant, and so the plant puts more energy into fewer flowers and grows larger fruit. The disadvantages of that is if you don't care if the fruit are large, you're decreasing some of your total yield, the amount of fruit on the plant. And sometimes if you prune them down very severely to 1 or 2 stems, you can encourage things like blossom red rot or sun scald with a lot of sun directly on the fruit. The leaves need direct sun. The fruit doesn't typically like, it likes to be a little bit more shaded in the canopy of the plant. But the key here is knowing the type of plants you have in order to know whether you can prune a lot or not. And so when we talk about tomato plants, there's 2 major categories of tomato plants. Some are determinate and some are indeterminate. And determinate plants are very short. They grow very short. They have a brief harvest period. You would not want to prune a lot on a determinate plant because they're a compact plant. If we think about the paste types and the types that have been bred for commercial machine harvest, those are all determinate. They grow short, they have a concentrated harvest, and don't need a lot of pruning. Contrast that with most of the heirloom tomato varieties are very tall. They have a long harvest. They ripen a fruit throughout the summer. They typically can take more pruning and need more support to support them up. And then somewhere in between is what we call the semi-determinate types. They're medium-sized, 3-4 feet tall. They have a somewhat spread out harvest. You can prune them lightly. They need a little less support. And these are the types that most commercial hybrids are that are grown locally for fresh market tomatoes. And garden varieties like Celebrity is one example of a semi-determinate plant that will get 3, 4, maybe 5 feet tall. Whereas the heirlooms get 8, 10 feet tall over the growing season, and the paste types maybe 2 or 3 feet tall. And here's an image of the two plant types. The indeterminate sends out a flower cluster along its stem, and then the stem keeps growing, whereas a fully determinate plant sends out a flower cluster, sets fruit, and that stem will no longer grow, which is why they're more of a compact plant, and all those fruit end up ripening at the same time. Whereas with an indeterminate, more flowers will form along the stem and ripen up. We also sometimes get questions about brown tissue in the fruit, and that's typically caused by what we call cat facing, another physiological disorder, which is caused by temperature extremes when the plant is pollinating. So you can get the flower part sticking to the fruit, not pollinating correctly. It often happens early in the season when people push the limits of growing their tomatoes and set them out early, and it gets below 50 degrees at night while the flower buds are forming. And then you'll get later on, as the fruit forms, it forms improperly and gets cat facing. So if we're putting them out early, we want to protect them from that cold temperature and harden with limiting water instead of cold temperatures. And some of the bigger beefsteak types of varieties, some of the heirlooms, are more prone to this problem, which with some of the bigger beefsteak types, people accept more of that brown tissue because they've got more to cut off and eat. Fruit cracking, there's 3 types of cracking we talk about, starting left to right, is radial cracks of a fruit, concentric cracks in the middle, and it's a little bit harder to see on the right, is what we call weather checking, or roughness on the surface of the fruit. Most of these cracks are caused by too much water, so we try and have moderate amounts of water on our tomato plants. We don't want to overwater. We don't want torrential downpours and moisture that sits on the fruit. That's what causes the weather checking. The water gets into the fruit, and the skin expands more greatly, thins out, and expands more rapidly, and causes cracking. And definitely different varieties have different resistance to cracking. A lot of the commercial varieties have been bred to be firmer, so they don't crack and ship and move around better than your softer garden varieties, which in some cases might taste a little bit better. So that's up to you, but you run a little bit more risk of cracking. We also get questions about growing tomatoes in containers. And I remind folks to try and, if you're going to do that, you certainly can grow tomatoes in containers. You want to match the variety to the container size. So there's some really compact hanging basket type of varieties of tomatoes, which can be grown in a very small container. But if you're talking a larger tomato, best to have a large container. I tell people a 5-gallon bucket or larger is usually what you need in order to have success, get a vigorous plant, and for it to get all the evenly moisture and fertilization it needs. If you're away all day long, you might want to think about a self-watering container, again, so that you don't run into blossom end rot. We typically recommend container mixes that are designed to be in a container for the soil, or instead of soil, really, it's a container mix. They're usually composed of things like peat moss, perlite, cocoa fiber. They may have fertilizer added in lime, and designed to drain properly in a container. If you just shovel soil into a container or compost, you often run into problems that they don't drain properly in a confined container. And then you have to match a fertilizer source and use with that container. One of the challenges with a container is the plant is totally reliant on you, or largely reliant on you, for fertilizer and water. Whereas if they're in the soil, there's a little bit more of a buffer where if you miss a day or your fertilizer is a little bit light, the roots can scavenge some other nutrients from the surrounding soil. So before I open up for further questions in the chat room and discussion, I want to remind you on our great tomato tasting at home website, We have some resources you can avail yourself after this webinar. So we have a lot of fact sheets and bulletins covering tomatoes, culture, cultural recommendations, pest problems, and pest issues that you can look at. We also have a variety database with pictures of many different varieties of tomatoes that we've gathered over the years during the Great Tomato Tasting event that we've grown at the farm. A little bit of attributes on their traits and such. You can look up the shape and color and look at those if you're wondering what a particular variety might look like. We also have a few varieties of tomatoes that we've helped release and or re-release over the years, such as the Rutgers 250, Ramapo, Morton, KC 146 are some of the seeds we sell through our website there, and then also our Jersey tomato t-shirts that we've had at the tasting events in the past. You can order through that website under the resources. And of course, we have lots more resources under our Rutgers NJAS website. You can avail yourself if you're talking about other crops and gardening questions that you might have. So with that, why don't I open it up to some questions, Bill?
Peter, I think most of the questions we've got under control here, but somebody did ask, will we be sharing this recording after the webinar?
We will. We're recording it now, and we'll put it up on the web on the Great Tomato Tasting at Home website after the session.
We did have a question earlier on using, someone said they read they could use Tums for if they have lack of calcium, and I said it's probably better to use lime. Yes, you could use ingredients with calcium in, but it's actually cheaper and better to use a product that's intended for that use. So.
Yeah, I would think Tums were expensive. I mean, people often ask about eggshells. Eggshells contain a lot of calcium.
Correct. Yeah.
Sure. But it may not be readily available to the plant. And usually blossom end rot is more of a water relations practice.
Yeah, it's kind of what we found. In a lot of cases, it might just be a period of time where the water's not taking up because the water has to bring the calcium up into the plant. So even watering does help a lot.
Yeah, even there's calcium sprays they sell. However, if you've waited to the point where you see blossom end rot, the calcium spray is too late, and most of the research that I've seen didn't show the calcium sprays on the leaves actually were effective.
We have used some of the calcium sprays, and they are very effective, and they work very rapidly. That's the nice thing about them. Someone just asked a question. Why does it take so long for my tomatoes to ripen? It took this person, they said, over a month for their tomatoes to ripen. I think it's more of a matter of the tomato itself and the normal development of the tomato, but you can speak to that, Pete.
Well, a month is about kind of the average, I think, for most tomatoes. It does take about a month from 30 days from flowering to fruit. Obviously, the larger the tomato, it's going to take longer, or maybe a few days longer. And if a cherry or a grape, it's going to be a few days shorter. But I'm not surprised at a month. Obviously, the weather, the heat conditions will affect that, the amount of sunlight on the plant. Bill and I were actually discussing that question earlier, because every year gardeners complain to us that we've got green fruit, but they're not coming. And I almost think it's like the watched pot never boils. They're anxious for those tomatoes, and they'll move along when they can and when they will. But I don't know if it's impatience, really. And one of the main things, you have to have more patience.
Yeah, I agree, because I think it's just normal development. We did get a question here on squirrels, and I know that we have built squirrel cages in areas by just using chicken wire and putting right over the current cage or structure that you have to hold the tomatoes up. That's the only way you can, at least we found that we can effectively keep squirrels out, is to put like a little squirrel cage around with chicken wire. I don't know what else you have used, Pete, that's worked.
rodent animals are tough because all people complain a lot about chipmunks as well. Literature I've read, they can eat anything that they can get their head through. So chipmunks may be able to get through chicken wire at some points. Young but yeah, you would need a creature like that really. Kind of the only way to keep them out. It can be very tough.
So someone also asked here about crop rotation. They have a raised bed garden that they're working in, 6x4 beds, and they just say you put the tomatoes in a garlic bed next year, for example. And what I usually tell people is to plant plants from different families. So if you have the solanaceous family, tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, potatoes, try to avoid planting those in the same location 2 years in a row. Do you have any additional comments on that, Peter?
No, yeah, you're trying to avoid the same family like peppers and eggplants or potatoes. I would try and avoid those crops in the same bed, and move them as far and as long as possible. So ideally, you would be back for tomatoes for 3 or 4 years. So in a garden situation, that can be really tough. So, if it's 2 years, it's better than none. And if you can't rotate, then you need to avail yourself of those other practices. From below, sanitation, get that debris, that's disease out of the garden. Otherwise, those are dangerous spores.
So someone is also asking about, if they can't rotate, how about killing the spores, that might be in the soil. But what we've recommended that people do is you can use soil solarization, or just by tilling the soil, and exposing the spores, or adding additional compost. But also you can grow in containers. That if you have that area, just have some fresh soil like you're talking about, or fresh growing medium, and periodically grow above ground as well. That works. But it's, unless you're doing soil solarization, and most homeowners aren't going to have a lot of other options to kill the spores. But like Peter said, that if you clean up at the end of the season, I think that's the most important thing, making sure that no disease spores are left in the garden.
Yeah, one of the benefits of the container mixes that I didn't mention is a lot of times they're pasteurized in order to kill spores, or they're made out of materials like peat moss and compost. Peat moss or cocoa hulls that doesn't typically contain spores from diseases. So you're starting clean with that kind of container mix, compared to if you were digging up soil from your garden trying to put it in a pot, or even, again, sometimes compost, if it's not cleaned up properly, it doesn't kill the spores.
So we have a few questions here on diseases. One is current suggestions for treatment of early blight. I know you went over that a little bit. Do you want to touch on that again?
Well, again, the early blight and Septoria, the leaf diseases, thrive on leaf wetness. So anything you can do to keep the leaves drier, not getting them wet. You can't stop the rain. Watering from below, watering in the morning is important. Spacing the buckets out a little bit more will help them dry.
And we have
sanitation and the crop rotation.
Yeah, I agree. There's also a question on how many years to rotate. We normally, on our farm and on our areas, we rotate a crop at least 3 to 4 years out, and not put them back in the same spot if you can do it. If you can go longer, it's even better. But the idea is, like we said before, not to grow plants in the same family in the same spot, year after year after year. Some people do get away with it, but it increases the chances of carryover of disease spores in that area. Also, there's a question on, have you had any experience with using repellents like Irish Spring, soap, or Coyote urine to deter Alvin and the Chipmunks?
I've not tried those things, and repellents usually, well, I don't know so much for rodents. A lot of them are used for deer, and it's marginally effective at best, or short-term effective. I don't know. Look at these things. So.
I'm sorry, Pete, you cut out on this end.
Have you looked at any of those repellents for rodents? I've only seen people using them for deer more than rodents.
We have not had effective control of rodents with those repellents, to be honest with you. You know, at times, if there's low pressure, if you have a lot of a pretty large crop, we find that you really have to fence animals out as much as you possibly can. It's the only thing that really does work if you can keep them out of the area. We find that growing herbs around the area can be helpful, just because a lot of these animals don't like the taste or the smell of herbs, but it's not 100%. You're still going to have them get in there unless you can keep them out. It's good to have a nice hungry cat around.
Yeah.
We have some other questions here. Let's see. I'm a transplant in Florida. I've ordered seeds from Rutgers. The Morton tomato is doing fine, but the Scarlet Sunrise has not shown any sign of growth. I started all in a 3-inch pot, and Morton has taken off, but no growth on the Scarlet Sunrise. Any ideas?
No growth means no, it didn't germinate.
That's the information I have right here on the question. So, you know, if that, Dolores, if you can just give us a little bit more information, we would be happy to answer your question.
Yeah, I know I've sent packets to other researchers and such, and they've grown them out in New York and other places, so I'm not sure what might be going on there. You can send an email to the site you got those seeds from.
Yeah, Dolores, we could follow up with you. So go ahead and send us an email to the site with a little bit more information, and we'd be happy to answer your questions. There's a question here from Joseph. Is it useful to cover the tomato plants in periods of high temperatures over 90 degrees?
I don't know that I've seen a lot of gardeners do it. It is true, you know, once they get above that rate, the flowers are bored. I had a grower one time who said, look at my great early tomatoes. I used cages with plastic around them, which really got a great start. And I looked at them, he pointed to it from a distance, and the plants were huge. He said, yeah, they're huge, but there's no fruit on them because the temperature got too hot in those cages and they imported all the flowers. So if it was above 90 later in the season, you might with some kind of cover.
Yeah, we found in some of our fields for production that if the temperature is extremely high at night because of the origin of the development of the tomato, that you, like you said, you could have flower abortion. And whether you cover them or not, if it stays hot during the evening, tomatoes like the evening to recover. And if they don't get a little bit cooler evening, sometimes we'll see loss of flowers.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can't really, a cover won't change the evening temperature too much, but it shouldn't be above 90, hopefully, at that time.
There's a question here. If your plant has Septoria leaf spot or gray blight, can you let the plant continue to grow and eat the fruit? The answer would be yes, you can.
Yeah, most people do. Most farmers and gardeners get early blight and Septoria to some degree later in the season. Again, it comes on when they start to fruit, so you're going to always have that. If you've lost all of the foliage, the fruit might not have much sugar to them. It might not taste so good. But I mean, certainly, and some of the more semi-determinate or indeterminate plants kind of keep growing at the top. And sometimes, you know, if it dries out a little bit more, they can kind of outgrow the disease slightly and keep harvesting.
We have a question here about, does early picking affect taste?
Early picking, did you say?
Yes, early picking, early harvesting.
Early harvest. Well, I guess what I find in trying to breed the plant for earliness, you're challenging the plant to produce fruit quickly. I don't don't think, a lot of times the earliest varieties don't have the best taste. It's more of a mid-season, but usually is a little bit better. It's really challenging plant. I guess also, if they're talking about picking the fruit off the plant early, once you get to the point of the I think you'd be hard pressed to tell the difference between picked fruit and a fully red fruit. Now, some regions of the country pick what we call mature green, so the fruit looks pretty much green, and they pick them then, and they'll still ripen. But most growers want to have some color and would say that they don't take big.
There is a question here on birds pecking at the tomatoes. We actually saw a lot of this year on some locations, and the Gail is asking, are they doing that for the water? And would it help to put a bowl of water out in the field? Do you have any experience with this working? Or are they actually trying to get the seeds? What do they want? That's the question.
My guess is they are probably looking for a little bit of moisture, since they only pick a little bit and move on, or either that or they're getting frightened away. I don't know if anybody can put out water and solve that issue. I don't know if you've had any experience in that.
We have not. We actually have seen more damage this year from bird damage, and I would guess it is a moisture issue because it was during the dry part of the season. But we did not put out any water for the birds to see if that would deter them. We just put some scarecrow devices out there. We hung some CDs from and other Mylar tape, and that seemed to be effective at keeping the birds out. So we typically will use Mylar, we'll use old CDs and hang them from a stake, and the birds see that, and it typically does scare them out of the area.
Yeah, I mean, most farms have irrigation ponds, so there is water available, but they may not want to fly all that way and go to the pond, or maybe they're more exposed in the pond, that kind of thing.
Someone's asking about experience with dwarf tomato varieties.
Well, some of those dwarf varieties definitely are grown for containers. I've seen some that stay really small and can grow well in containers. The maple basket or something small. You can get a comparable harvest. You don't have a very large plant, so they're not going to produce a ton. But it's maybe a little bit more of a novelty. I'm not sure what your experience is.
We haven't had great luck with the dwarf varieties. They produce okay, but in my mind, if you have, like you were saying, if you have a 5-gallon bucket, you can pretty much grow most of the varieties as long as you support them. And I tend to go for the typical varieties that we produce because I like the flavor of them. Some of the dwarf plants I've just and those that are 4 small containers, I have not had the same luck with getting the same level of flavor out of those. So we tend to grow the standard varieties and just provide adequate space in the container.
Yeah, again, if you have a really small space, it would be something you might want to take advantage of. There are varieties that are called dwarf indeterminate that grow on a very compact plant. So they're easier to stake, but again, it's usually comparable to their size. But if you have a very restricted space, it might be something to play with.
Somebody asked about the CDs. Yes, just old music CDs or anything that's reflective that will swing in the reflect light and scare the birds as the wind blows is very effective. We use Mylar tape, which is reflective on one side and red on the other, and that works quite well. Someone asked a question here. I read that towards the end of the season, if you want your plant to focus itself on ripening the fruit before frost, rather than growing taller, you should cut the leader. When would you recommend doing that in this area?
So that is, you kind of have to know the mature height of the plant. And yeah, I would definitely wait till later in the season to do something like that. I know growers have tried that with heirlooms. So commercial growers are usually used to staking plants on 3-foot stakes, or 4-foot stakes pounded into the ground foot, so the plant gets 3 feet tall. And it's harder for them to grow heirlooms up that are going to grow 8 feet tall. One grower tried to restrict them to the 3 feet, cut them back. And it was kind of a disaster because the plant, you couldn't make an 8-foot plant go 3 feet. But if it's an 8-foot plant and you want to go 7, maybe about now, Bill, but you have to be the time to come. You don't want to go too early, and it's hard to know how warm it'll be into the fall that they'll keep going. But you have to figure 30 days from flower to fruit, so it takes some time.
So I did see that some people are asking some questions in Q&A too, so I'm just looking there. Let's see here. Somebody did ask about how much water per week, so I just responded that about 1 inch to 1.5 inches. Typically, on our production tomatoes, we're probably at about 1.5 inches of irrigation per week on most of our fields. And I would say about the same in the garden, wouldn't you?
Yeah, but if you got rainfall, you'd subtract that from that, right?
Right. So we don't, if you can, put a rain gauge out in your garden and monitor how much rainfall you're getting per week. There is a question here in Q&A about solarizing effectively. Can it be done with a small raised bed? We have done soil solarization where you have to let the land sit aside for a while, but what we'll do is we'll moisten down a bed, put plastic over it to lock that in and actually let the sun bake that area for the hot part of the season, July and August, if you're going to do complete solarization. But you have to have adequate moisture throughout the soil in order to get that heat effectively to solarize that area. But you're setting aside that area for quite a while. This is something they do, and I know Guatemalans, I was talking to some researchers down there, and they actually do quite a bit with soil solarization because they don't have some of the chemical controls that we do in the United States.
Yeah, I think it's more effective in a hotter climate. We don't have consistent sunlight and heat, and you're taking your production area out of business for like July and August, so it's a tough thing to do. I think it's more inconsistent in New Jersey to do that than it would be in a hot climate.
Somebody's asking about whiteflies, that they've had more problems this year and what to do about them.
Yeah, they can be a challenge. Insecticidal soaks can help. I'm trying to think of some of the other materials that could be applied. I haven't seen a ton of problems this year.
No, not with whiteflies. We have not. But sometimes just effectively washing them off the plant. But whiteflies are a little bit more problematic because they will fly back. But some, depending on other types of insect problems, sometimes you can just get away with rinsing the plant. But we have used insecticidal soaps this year where we did start to see some infestation, and it's quite effective. You just want to make sure, read the label, that particular product is labeled for tomatoes. And if you're trying to go organic, you want to use OMRI approved materials, and the OMRI stands for Organic Materials Research Institute. So you could look for those materials if you care to use them.
Yeah, the other thing would be to plant a few flowers that are attracted to beneficial insects that might help knock back the population. I know the populations sometimes get ahead of those things, but making sure there's a few flowers to attract beneficial would be another on the white flies.
Somebody was also asking about a cover crop for raised beds, preferably something that will winter kill.
Yeah, so farmers in the area typically use winter rye, which they plant in the fall, and that'll survive the winter and then shoot for the stars in the spring. And I find that to be very difficult for gardeners because then they'll have trouble filling that in the spring. Gardeners typically don't have tractors, so that's much harder. So I typically recommend oat because it'll grow for a little while in the fall, and then winter comes when it gets a hard freeze. So it'll take a light frost, but and then it's much easier to turn in the spring. So oat is what I recommend for gardeners.
Someone is also asking about in the Q&A, how often should we add fertilizer for containers?
Well, I guess it depends on what you do with. Maybe every 2 weeks or something like that, a small amount is probably the best way to go. You kind of have to follow the label. That's the tricky part of containers, to know when it's too little or too much. I don't know if you have any other.
Typically, I tell people not to overdo it with fertilizer. I tend to use a little bit of well-rotted compost so that whatever fertilizer I do add, it tends to stick around longer if I increase the organic matter. Constantly adding water-soluble fertilizer, not such a great idea. And as like you were talking about, up until the point of fruiting, if you overdo it with a fertilizer, you get this huge plant. And you don't get adequate production. You can give them a little shot of fertilizer after they do start fruiting, and I find that helps, but stay on the lower end unless you actually see problems with the tomatoes, because you can easily overwater the plant or over fertilize the plants if you don't watch what you're doing.
Yeah, keeping an eye on the growing tips. They'll usually tell you, if they start to turn yellow, that you've got a nutrient deficiency. But you're right too, I would agree. Hitting them when they set fruit is the best idea, not beforehand with too much fertilizer. It'll get, vegetative and grow leaves instead of fruit, which is not ideal.
That's all that's saying, Peter. If anybody has any more questions, if they could put them in the chat box instead of the Q&A, because I'm trying to bounce back and forth. Now, the chat box is right, if you look in the center of your screen where there's a circle, you click on that and your chat box will open right up to the right. So put your questions in there and it's much easier for us to review them. I think we've answered most of the questions here. Also, someone had asked before about in terms of storage of tomatoes, and typically we don't recommend that you put tomatoes in the refrigerator right after you pick them. It tends to pull the flavor out of a good Jersey tomato. So we store them, cool, dry location. But, you don't want it too hot. You don't want it too cool, because the coolness will pull that flavor from the plant.
Yeah, the below 50 degrees is kind of detrimental to tomato flavor. So we don't recommend refrigerator. Another tip on storing tomatoes is they ripen from the bottom up. And so I always, if you notice when they come from a farm, they're always putting the box on top, on their shoulders, upside down, because it starts getting soft from the bottom. And so the shoulder can take more weight than the bottom of the fruit. And so you can put them that way. And then later in the season, if you get to the point where it's going to frost and you have fruit left, someone asked earlier, is it hurt flavor if you harvest them early? Again, if they're really green, it might affect the flavor a bit. But if they're got some color, you can harvest them, put them upside down, and ripen them that way just naturally. Or you could also put them in a paper bag with a banana or an apple, which releases ethylene gas, which will speed up the ripening of a tomato a little bit. That's a natural ripening gas. And if you want to get them to the ripe state quicker, you can add a little bit of the banana or apple. The ethylene gas will ripen them quicker.
Peter, there's a question here on spacing, layout and spacing. This year, this individual, Jason, had 4x6 beds with about 18 plants. He built a string system to stake them. He's got fair production, but he would like some guidance on spacing for next year.
Well, most plants can be about 18 inches apart between the plants. Probably talking 3, 4, 5 feet between rows. If they're heirlooms, I push them apart even further because they're usually an indeterminate large plant, maybe 2 feet apart within the row. I think that addresses his question, Bill.
Yes, yeah, about 1.5 to 2 feet is what we typically recommend. Someone asked, when is the growing season over for tomatoes in New Jersey? And usually it's when we get our frost because we grow tomatoes on our farm right up to the frost. Unless you have a high tunnel, of course, and then you can keep growing them.
Yeah, and you can use floating row cover, a cloth-like material draped over the plants. If you see a frost threatening, if you drape that over in the afternoon, capture a little bit of heat, that gives you a couple degrees if it's just a light frost, and it might get you through to a little while longer. Again, you're getting into cold temperatures then, so sometimes the flavor won't be what it is in the summer, but probably better than what you typically can buy in the supermarket in the winter.
Somebody's asking about what would actually delay ripening on the vine. What would be some causal things to delay ripening?
Lack of moisture, maybe, well, shade issues. If you're growing in shade, it's going to be slower without enough sunlight. Fertility, maybe, but usually those, and temperature, of course, if it's cool or too hot, the plant isn't growing well. I'm trying to think what else might be there, Bill. Those are just some of the things that I can think of right off the bat. And again, I think people look at the fruit, and it does take 30 days to go from flower to fruit. So they get, they're anxious to eat those good tasting Jersey tomatoes.
Sorry, Pete, you were cutting out on my mic there. So let's see here. I think we've answered most of the questions on here. And thank you, Megan, for getting back to a couple of people on the links for today. I do not see additional questions. Oh, one person asked about the leader. What is the leader on a tomato?
The leader is the main stem usually, and you can have multiple stems on the tomato when you first plant it. We usually have, you know, the main stems with the leader. As you follow the plant straight up, that is the main leader of the plant. But again, those suckers will grow later, and so you'll have multiple leaders and multiple stems as the plant grows during the season.
I think that's about it. I would just encourage everyone to, you'll see the polling on the right side of your screen, and we would most greatly appreciate if you could take a moment to fill out the poll and give us that valuable feedback.
We would appreciate that, and I've put up, hope you can see on the screen, the more activities today coming up at 3 to 3:15, a Facebook Live on peach tomato salsa, a virtual tour of the research at the farm, a session, a webinar on eating and preserving tomatoes, and then the talk on tomatoes and Rutgers, past, present, and future later on this evening. We appreciate you all coming out for our virtual Great Tomato Tasting at Home. We hope we will be in person again real soon with lots of our educational activities. And I think Megan put in the chat box the link to the Great Tomato Tasting at Home. That's where the recordings will be posted later. and a lot of our resources are available for you for the future there.
Pete, before you log off, I have to ask you and Megan, what are your favorite tomato varieties personally?
Well, of course, Rutgers 250 is near and dear to my heart, and also the new Rutgers Scarlet Sunrise.
And I think it's Cherokee Red or Cherokee. That's my other.
Cherokee Purple?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's one of my favorites too. I have a lot of favorites because I eat a lot of tomatoes, but I love Celebrity, Matt's Wild Cherry, Mortgage Lifter. Sun Gold is my favorite cherry tomato of all time. That's just an amazing tomato. We started growing that on our commercial farm because people were asking for it all the time. But yeah, and I always love the Matt's Wild Cherry too. But anyway, those are some of my faves. Thank you much, Pete.
Thank you, Bill. Again, hopefully you can take advantage of the rest of the day's activities and maybe some webinars we hold in the future. And again, hopefully take advantage of many of our in-person events down the road. If you didn't already, please fill out the poll. I see a lot of people are working on it right now. I see some folks are sharing their favorite varieties in the panel, in the chat room. Some folks are mentioning heirloom varieties and splitting, which is always a challenge with some of the heirlooms. They tend to be softer skinned, have good flavor, but some of them split. That was one of the challenges we tried to tackle when we developed the Scarlet Sunrise. It's a little bit firmer than some fruit like Sun Gold and some of the others, and splits a little bit less. Well, I want to thank my coworkers, Megan Muehlbauer and Bill Hlubik, for joining in and assisting me with this webinar. I want to thank all of you for joining in and asking great questions and making great comments about growing tomatoes in the home garden. New Jersey's favorite vegetable. Hopefully you have great success this year and in the future. Hopefully you learned a few things and enjoyed our webinar. And again, hopefully you can take advantage of some of the other webinars and Facebook Live events later in the day. And we hope to see you in the future. Thanks again.